The People of the Secret. Chapter 10. Assassins, Kali worshippers, Dervishes. The theory that we have approached in this book is that humanity has been continuously under the guardianship of an initiate tradition. The real nature of this tradition, its activities and its methods, has always been the most closely guarded secret. This does not mean that its agents have always been invisible. On the contrary, they have been part of life. They have been prophets and priest-kings in whom a superior role was explicit. They have also been artists and scientists, monks, handymen and tinkers, accepted as part of the common life, but unsuspected of their hidden role. But in whatever form they have appeared, their real aim and the inner nature of their activity has always been massively obscured. From time to time, however, the powers possessed by such men have been suspected, and these suspicions have been incorporated in folklore and the legends of magic. But the nature of the energies disposed at these levels, and the training which leads to their incorporation in a human being, have never been divulged. The reasons are obvious. Atlantis, whatever reality, physical or otherwise, is indicated by the word, is said to have ended in an apocalypse because knowledge of higher energies and the techniques associated with them leaked out to those in whom personal egoism was still the central motivation. At some stage in the history of Egypt, the same is said to have happened. There, a pyramidic social structure ensured that every horizontal cross-section of the pyramid contributed to the well-being of the level below and received sustenance from the level above. The base was in touch with the earth, and the apex was a king initiate in touch with another order of things outside life. Initiation, probably always a calculated risk, was at some stage unwisely conferred. Techniques then began to pass out of the control of purified sources and became available for egoistic ends. This was the magic of the self-will, the sorcery of the self against which Moses inveighed. Egypt before the sands began to go down. Men of development, acting as the agents of powers outside life, have been known by many names. In turn, initiates, priest-kings, prophets, masters, patriarchs, hanifs, and many others now lost. If our assumption is correct, this range of activity has, since the 7th century AD, been the province of Sufic orders, or those of the Sufic orders which have not themselves succumbed to involuntary erosion. This period of some 1200 years has not escaped its share of the disasters which follow the leakage of classified psychic material. The career of Hassan Saba, the historical old man of the mountains, seems to provide an example. Perhaps because the outward form of Islam was used to an exceptional degree as the instrument of a major developmental operation, there seems to have been a tendency for fringe information about psychic and spiritual techniques to become relatively public. Knowledge of such techniques, fragmented but still potent, passed into the hand of factions struggling for political supremacy in the various caliphates. One such faction, the ancestors of the present-day Ismailis, tried to use psychological techniques deriving from genuine school for political and indeed criminal ends. One center of such activity was the Abode of Wisdom in Cairo under the Fatimite caliphs. Their techniques, either deduced or stolen from Sufic sources, were employed to develop a secret society dedicated to political intrigue and assassination. Bernard Springett, Secret Sects in Syria, quoting from A Short History of the Assassins by Amir Ali, says, "The different degrees adopted in the lodge, the Abode of Wisdom, forms an invaluable record of Freemasonry. In fact, the lodge at Cairo became the model of all lodges created afterwards in Christendom." Elsewhere, Springett claims that the constitution of the Knights Templar was a servile copy of that of the Assassins. As is well known, there was considerable contact between the Crusaders and the Assassins. It is widely believed that Hassan Saba, the infamous founder of the Assassins, was a renegade of the Abode of Wisdom. Whether he was or not, he had certainly studied under a very famous teacher, the Imam Muwafiq. Other pupils at the same time have been said to include Nizam, a future prime minister to the Turkish Sultan of Persia, and the now world-famous Omar Khayyam. Of Hassan, Nizam was later to write, "He proved to be a fraud, hypocrite, and self-seeking villain. He was so clever at dissimulation that he completely captured the mind of the Shah." Hassan became, in fact, a sort of Hitler of the 11th century, equaling the latter in perfidy and certainly surpassing him in psychological knowledge. Utilizing techniques apparently deriving from the abode of wisdom, Hassan maintained himself for 34 years as the undisputed autocrat of one of the most remarkable armies in all history. The Assassins. His troops were 70,000 fanatics reduced by a technique of brainwashing to military zombies. From his castle at Alamut, described 150 years later by Marco Polo, Hassan engineered palace revolutions, assassinations and wars for his own advantage. He made pacts with Saracens against the Crusaders and with the Crusaders against his own fellow religionists. He murdered, tortured and intrigued to the point where he was able through sheer terror to transfer Ismaili loyalty from the caliphs to himself. An assassin recruit might be sent to work and live 1,000 miles away, there to wait for years for the order to plunge his dagger into somebody whose death was essential to his master's plans. Hassan's agents extended through every country in the east, intriguing and killing at Hassan's orders till no life was safe, and the shadow of an assassin dagger seemed to hang over everyone in power from the Caspian to Egypt. At one stage, a representative of the Sultan reached Alamut bearing, a little optimistically, an ultimatum to Hassan. For answer, the old man of the mountains raised his hand, and a white-robed guard standing on a rampart answered that he understood and obeyed, then hurled himself 2,000 feet to the river in the valley below. Hassan had achieved such discipline among his subjects that he could command instant suicide. Such extraordinary power seems even to have been transmitted. Henry of Champagne visited one of the assassin castles a century later and was given a similar demonstration by way of suggesting that Christian princes venturing in these parts were up against something qualitatively different from anything in Western military experience. Hassan, at the center of his empire of invisible terror, sent missionaries to Afghanistan and India and even farther afield. That so much is known about the cult is due to the circumstances of its destruction, or partial destruction, at the hands of the Mongol invader, Halaku Khan, in 1335. Halaku's chief minister was ordered to complete a history of the assassins, which he did, greatly helped by the fact that the written constitution of the assassins was found in Alamut. Not so well known is that the cult of Thuggee, which bedeviled India during the whole period of British rule, is an Ishmaelic derivation of the assassin cult, transferred in part to the Hindu goddess Kali. How was the fanatical assassin discipline achieved? Western accounts turn on the idea that the assassin recruits were drugged with hashish, hence the word assassin from hashashin, the addicts. According to this story, novices were first stupefied with the drug, then taken to a stage-set garden of startling beauty with marvelous flowers and watercourses. There they reclined while seductive damsels caressed them and fed them sweetmeats. They were then doped again to unconsciousness, and on recovering were told that by the favor of their leader, they had been given access to a mystical experience which was a foretaste of paradise. Assured that provided they died in the service of their master, this bliss awaited them for all eternity, the recruits were prepared to obey any order and suffer any fate. Modern psychologists would probably contest that such a procedure would produce the inexorable conditioned reflex of obedience which the assassins undoubtedly exhibited. It is therefore interesting that there is another explanation from Sufic sources. This alleges that at the acceptance ceremony of a new recruit, Hassan took a square of silk weighted at the corners with a coin. Blessing the newcomer, Hassan swung it round the man's neck, at the same time exerting pressure on a nerve center in such a way as to produce instantaneous hypnosis. In this state, the novice had communicated to him the contents of Hassan's mind, a technique of non-verbal suggestion which Rudyard Kipling seems to have known about. The transfer of thought without verbalization is not known in the West generally, but the method of inducing a subcatatonic state by nerve pressure definitely is. It was practiced by a stage hypnotist within the last 20 years. He did it at several English variety theatres until privately warned to leave the country by a knowledgeable member of the British Medical Association. Hassan's initiation technique had another subtlety. The representation of bliss induced in the recruit's mind included the suggestion that the experience could be enjoyed again, in the act of committing murder at the order of the assassin chief. Hassan's pupils were therefore under both a conscious inducement and a post-hypnotic imperative. Known facts about Thuggee, the version of assassin practice which grew up in India, appears to support this account in a remarkable way. Major General Sir William Sleeman, the Britisher who was, almost, responsible for stamping out Thuggee in India, discovered some very strange facts about thug psychology. He found that they experienced an extraordinary sensation of pleasure in the process of ingratiating themselves with a band of travelers whom they intended to murder. They simulated friendliness and honesty to such an extent that they were quickly accepted by any travelers, however initially suspicious. It is known that part of the curriculum at the Abode of Wisdom in the early 11th century included intelligent dissimulation, a technique which enabled the assassins who mastered it to ingratiate themselves in any social conditions. For their murder by strangulation, the thugs used a silk weighted generally with a coin. Sleeman discovered that the act of strangling a victim produced a moment of ecstasy in the thug, which he declared made all other considerations in life seem unimportant. When the full account of assassin crime in the East 900 years ago is considered, and when it is recalled that Sleeman estimated Thuggee murders at 40,000 per year in the India of last century, the terrible consequences of occult knowledge falling into wrong hands are apparent. The European witch cult may be a further example of an activity arising from the leakage of developmental knowledge. Like the Albigenses, the witches are known chiefly from the accounts of their enemies, and it is possible that no objective assessment of witchcraft in its inner nature exists. Certainly, modern witches do not know the origins of their practices, and researchers are constantly struck by the avidity with which present-day witch groups seize on origins found for them by academic witchologists like Margaret Murray. Modern apologists of the cult like Gerald Gardner and Justine Glass appear to be engaged in plausible whitewashing, while the traditional Roman Catholic attitude, deriving from Inquisition material, is one of superstitious horror and vilification. Material of the Malleus Maleficarum variety, that is, intentional vilification, tends nowadays to defeat its own ends. Instead of confirming satanic practices at physical level, it suggests rather a turgid excitation of the lower levels of the human subconscious, psychological rather than physical goings-on. However, it seems undeniable that witchcraft has repeatedly shaded off into black magic of the most palpable kind, and modern material from Huysman's book, Là-bas, to current newspaper accounts of rural tombstone turners confirms this. The original nature of witchcraft remains in all probability unassessed. Though something like the cult has probably existed since Neolithic times, the version of it familiar to medieval Europe suggests that the original impulse obtained a high-octane fuel injection from a Sufic source. Sufic witch parallels are overwhelming. The ritual knife of the witches is called a thame. The same instrument of the Saracen two-horned cult is ad-damme. The winding sheet in which members of the two-horned dance their rituals is the kafan, which looks very like the origin of the word coven. Members of the two-horned call their meeting as zabat, powerful occasion, which is almost certainly the witch sabbat. Thomas A. Becket is rumored to have been connected with a ritual sacrifice. The legend has resemblances to disguised teaching material. Becket is said to have had a Saracen mother. There is some connection between the Order of the Garter and witchcraft, and there are plain correspondences between Garter and Sufic ritual. The areas in which witchcraft was strongest were the areas most strongly under Saracen influence. Spain was conquered in AD 711 and was not re-Christianized till 1492. Arabs were in Languedoc in 759 and in Provence from 889. They were strongly established also in Savoy, Piedmont, and Switzerland, all areas associated with witchcraft. A Father Gualchelm of St. Albans, Angers, reported in 1091 a great crowd passing him on the road. These, he decided, were the Harlequim of whom I have heard, but in which I did not believe. Harlequim may have been a corruption of Aglakin, a Sufic group known as the Silent One, who wore patchwork clothes. A tract of 1450, Errores Gaziorum, gives an account of a witch rite. Gaziorum would seem to be a Latinized version of Gazirites, the Arabic for Andalusians. Errores Gaziorum retranslated into Arabic would give Gulat al-Ghazarian, the errors of the Andalusians, where error is an Arabic technical term for a sectarian belief. The Sufic master Jalaluddin Rumi mentions riding on a stick, which is a familiar witch idea. A witch cult leader apprehended in Sweden during a witch pogrom of 1668 wore a turban, and like witch leaders in England, before and since, was invoked with the word antecessor. Antecessor in Arabic is kadim, which means both antecessor and ancient. Robin is a recurring witch name. The word in Persian is Rabin, he who sees the road, and in the Berber two-horned sect, the leader is referred to as Rabbans, our master. A considerable number of other links are given by Idries Shah in the Sufis. The connection between witchcraft, at any rate from the 10th century on, and some sort of Saracen cult activity seems beyond dispute. But what was the nature of the Saracen injection which gave rise to or so deeply affected the medieval witch cult of Europe? It may be that in researching for his book Witches and Sorcerers, Arkhan Daraul uncovered the exact occasion. Among Arab migrants to Spain around 1460 were a sect of Berber ecstatics called the Two-Horned. From the information given in the Sufis by Idries Shah, this seems to have been a Moroccan branch of a sect peculiar to the Aniza tribe of the Bedouins. They followed a teaching which had been given by a dervish member of the tribe, Abu el-Atahiyya, and because the Arabic for goat has the same consonantal root as Aniza, they adopted the goat as their clan badge. This poor goat has been appearing ever since, and is used to this day when the cover of a lurid paperback has to convey the idea of black magic. Incidentally, the tribal camel brand of the Aniza was a broad arrow which has appeared all through the centuries as the witch's mark. The Aniza certainly started something. According to Arkhan Daraul, a branch of this sect moved from Morocco into Spain. They were a non-proselytizing cult and well-disciplined. Members could be cast out for an infringement of the rules. About the time the Berber branch of this sect moved into Spain, some dissident members met a leader of the Spanish Jews, Rabbi Ishaq Toledano. Ishaq was the head of a Jewish group who had come together with the idea of seeing whether they could use traditional Jewish magic to stem the tide of persecution by the Christians, which was making Jewish life in Toledo all but impossible. It would appear that the dissident members of the Two-Horned were welcomed eagerly by Rabbi Ishaq as being likely to make a knowledgeable contribution to the operation the rabbi was trying to develop. In other words, the Two-Horned possessed genuine knowledge of a developmental technique, and this could be used or misused for magical ends. The combined organization which resulted, Jewish and Arab, appears to have amalgamated many of the components which the West was later to identify with witchcraft. Ishaq knew the dangers involved for himself and his followers if details of his magic operations against the Christian enemy leaked out, and he realized also, from the example of his Two-Horned recruits, the force that could be carried over to another organization by apostates. He devised a method of binding his group together. The idea was to commit his members to actions so atrocious that none would ever dare confess to them. In this way, the security of his new community would be absolute. He required his members to perform evil actions and to destroy the persons and property of non-members, particularly Christians, as a trade test for advancement within the community. He also introduced rituals involving sexual perversions and the eating of abominable material. Such activities were so far outside the accepted tolerance of ordinary people of any religion as to put participants outside the pale of humanity. He also used poisons and drugs, which cemented the bond. The sect worshipped an idol, unspecified, and when members of the cult were possessed by the spirit of the idol, they engaged in flagellation and the exchange of obscene kisses. A devout Muslim writer, Abdus Salam ibn Zumairi, who was deported from Spain 130 years later, left an extensive description of the cult which he implied was still flourishing in his day. Rumor had it that members of the sect could fly. About the time apostate members of the Two-Horned were collaborating with Rabbi Ishaq, the Dominican Inquisitor of Carcassonne, Jean Vinetti, produced a tract declaring that a new heresy had arisen, which was unconnected with the old corpus of rural beliefs which the Church had more or less tolerated. Trevor Roper regards this as a Dominican maneuver to get round Capitulum Episcopi. This was a sort of common law of ecclesiastical Europe dating from the views of Saint Boniface and Charlemagne in the 8th century. It said, in effect, that to believe in witches, much more to hunt and burn them, was an act of superstition unworthy of a Christian and should rank as heresy. Trevor Roper feels that some zealous orders of the Roman Church felt that this seriously inhibited their efforts to extirpate heresy, and the Dominicans at least intrigued with several popes to rescind it and so provide papal authority for large-scale witch hunting. The Dominicans apparently succeeded in 1484 when two of their number, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, obtained a bull from Innocent VIII, which authorized his beloved sons to extirpate witchcraft in the Rhineland. Trevor Roper sees the tract of Jean Vignetti, 30 years earlier, as the vital link in the chain of events which made this celebrated papal bull possible. By claiming that the witchcraft of the middle of the 15th century was an entirely new heresy, Vignetti removed it from the protection of the Capitulum Episcopi of 7 centuries earlier. There seems little doubt that some church orders were intensely interested in finding a way round the Capitulum, but it may be that Vignetti was not so far wrong in claiming that something qualitatively different had appeared on the scene. In the early part of the 15th century, there was a purely local and unorganized form of witchcraft, which with some exceptions the Church put up with. In the second half of the 15th century, there was a witchcraft in the form which Europe was to have till 1650 and beyond. In between, there was Rabbi Ishak and his new community. The inference is not conclusive, but it is highly suggestive. It is also interesting that the abominations alleged against the witches of the 15th and later centuries were in the same category as those developed for his own reasons by the Jewish black magician. The sequence of events strongly suggests that genuine developmental techniques possessed by a knowledge-able religious group were leaked by apostates to an outside source and gave rise to several centuries of evil and human suffering. In the light of these illustrations, it is not surprising that the nature of the powers latent in man is little mentioned, and the techniques by which they may be developed are mentioned not at all. Such powers may belong to the evolutionary future of the race, and may probably be developed at this stage only legitimately when the agent has been purified of self-will. As mentioned in the last chapter, the team of 5 investigators made contact with a Sufi order and explained the nature of their research. Would it be possible for outsiders to see either examples of the rumored Sufi powers or of the training which was said to produce them? It was finally agreed to let the team have limited facilities of this kind, including introduction to other Sufic sources, on certain conditions. The chief condition was that they would be allowed to watch some Sufic procedures, to ask for explanations, and to publish a report, provided the team could find a prior reference to the same phenomenon or the same technique in already published material. As this condition extended to the literature of all nations, it was not as restrictive as it seemed at first. It also allowed the team to use the well-known investigation technique of overlap. With reference to, say, telepathy, it might be possible to find fragmentary references in a dozen different sources. If these could be amalgamated to cover exactly the total incident witnessed, the team would be entitled to provide a composite picture in this way. Perhaps the single most startling discovery made by the team was the Sufi attitude to telepathy. Sufic telepathic powers are used on a worldwide scale in such a way as to discredit the idea that telepathy is possible. The team became convinced that controlled telepathy is possible and is used, in fact, as a practical communication system between individual Sufis and their group leader, and also between different Sufi groups. It is also used to obtain information from people and places which it is impracticable to contact in any other way. Telepathy is within the range of existing human mental power, but for reasons connected with the overall evolutionary situation of mankind, it is vital that this should not be realized at the present time, or indeed within the foreseeable future. Among Sufis, telepathy is invaluable as a means of communicating certain kinds of knowledge more efficiently than is possible by any other means. For example, to influence individuals and cultures as an integral part of the Sufi mandate to act upon the character and knowledge of man. However, the chief function of telepathy among Sufis is, and here a direct quote was permitted, to interfere with the success of telepathic experiment on the part of dangerous individuals. The team learned, greatly to its astonishment, that a protective telepathic countermeasure is manned by Sufis throughout the world. This is only occasionally breached by experimenters in the unauthorized category. Sufis claim that their telepathy is actually used to induce skepticism about the possibility of telepathy in the minds of people who might misuse it, if they could develop it. It is also used to motivate people towards useless and futile telepathic and other psychic or parapsychological efforts in order to divert them from premature discoveries in the field of esotericism. Such a sophisticated concept was wholly unexpected by the team. In this connection, the reported activities of American and Russian military authorities would seem to be relevant. Considerable efforts are at present being made to discover whether it would be possible to use telepathy for military and espionage purposes, probably given impetus by the report by Powells and Bergier to the effect that the Pentagon had conducted an experiment in telepathy between a control station and a clairvoyant in a U.S. nuclear submarine. The Russians intensified their work at 2 parapsychological research centers at Moscow under Professor Asratyan and at Leningrad under Professor Vassiliev. The Russians have declared that they consider telepathy a proven fact. The suggested mechanism is that brain radiation having the same speed as light emanates from the agent and triggers off nervous discharges in the brain of the subject, which can be rectified to give the image originally transmitted. Professor Vassiliev is reported to have succeeded in establishing telepathic communication between Leningrad and the Black Sea, but success to anything like operational standard appears to depend on special, rare subjects and repeated hypnosis. Well-informed amateurs claim that Vassiliev's work is far in advance of the much-publicized researches of J.B. Rhine, but have aroused little or no scientific interest. Due to the private enterprise of an English man and wife team, Gregory and Kozin, Vassiliev's work was translated into English. The Gregorys actually typeset, printed and bound the book themselves. Interest appears to have been almost nil, and the conclusions of Vassiliev have been ignored. From experiments the team were allowed to watch, it seems that the Sufis hold that a form of telepathy can influence plants, minerals, and inanimate objects in such a way as to help or hinder projects which would be advantageous or otherwise to mankind from the standpoint of the Sufi mandate. The team was told categorically that telepathic powers are currently used, and have been used through the whole of historical times, to influence human cultures in such a way that a tension and rivalry is maintained. This offsets natural inertia and ensures that cultures attain their norm of productivity over an historical period. The team noticed that in admitting their use of telepathy and similar powers, the Sufis seemed to concentrate on broad concepts like the dynamics of human interaction, and almost wholly to ignore sentimental concepts like good people, my country, and such, like local or limited classifications. The Sufic attitude seemed to be that moral values were not of permanent validity, but should rightly be regarded as instruments for achieving evolutionary gains. Moral values which fail to make or cease to make such a contribution should be regarded as expendable and replaced with others. It was asserted that both individuals and communities exist, generally unknown to the public, who possess telepathic and paranormal functions and use these for selfish end. Although they have limited success temporarily, these people in the end destroy themselves, and the destructive influence extends to their associates in proportion as they have been attracted by similar motivation. The Sufis refused to claim that they were the only organization with the knowledge to invoke such paranormal powers. They said there was no point in making such a claim, as it would only attract or repel the sort of people whom they did not want to contact, either in cooperation or in opposition. It was categorically stated that all official and academic experiment in telepathy would come to nothing, even though it might be possible to claim from time to time that proof of such a faculty had been established. One Sufi allowed himself to be quoted, "Since we have prescience as well, it can be stated that the necessary effort and ingenuity to accomplish the art of telepathy will not be marshaled during the entire foreseeable period of generations in which this power could be a significant aid to humanity." Methods of developing telepathic ability observed by the team were surprisingly simple, but the terms of their agreement prevent a description of the details. It was emphasized that this must be carried out under the immediate direction of a genuine Naqshbandi teacher. Many imitators exist. No reference in literature could be found which was sufficiently germane to allow its use as an illustration of the Sufi practice. Clairvoyance. One of the traditional procedures used by Sufis of all branches involves obtaining information of things past, present, and future by a form of divination. This capacity continually influences the behavior of a Sufi teacher and explains some of the apparent rationality with which Sufic leaders are taxed. When he acts in a way which appears to be unrelated to the problem in hand, it may be because he has, by instant perception, seen the matter in added dimensions. He sees the past of the incident and by looking into the future sees the effect which would be produced by various alternative actions on his part. Although the processes which will now be suggested from accounts already published appear to be lengthy, they really describe an elementary stage in the use of paranormal psychology. The Sufi master is able to achieve the end result instantaneously and even while carrying on an ordinary conversation. The best description of Sufic clairvoyance, covering the team's experience, appears in the Modern Egyptians of E.W. Lane. Lane presents the practitioner as a magician, but there are reasons to believe he was a dervish. The Sufis incidentally do not regard cognition across time and space as either miraculous or having any special sanctity. It is regarded simply as a procedure using ordinary known forces. In this connection, the Sufis appear to be closer to Western materialist thinking than occultists. Lane describes his experience. I had prepared by the magician's direction some frankincense and coriander seed. He generally requires some benzoin to be added to these, and a chafing dish with some live charcoal in it. These were now brought into the room, together with the boy who was to be employed. He had been called in, by my desire, from among some boys in the street, returning from a manufactory, and was about 8 or 9 years of age. In reply to my inquiry respecting the description of persons who could see in the magic mirror of ink, the magician said that they were a boy not arrived at puberty, a virgin, a black female slave, and a pregnant woman. The chafing dish was placed before him and the boy, and the latter was placed on a seat. The magician now desired my servant to put some frankincense and coriander seed into the chafing dish. Then, taking hold of the boy's right hand, he drew, in the palm of it, a magic square, of which a copy is here given. 492, 357, 816. The figures which it contains are Arabic numerals. In the center, he poured a little ink and desired the boy to look into it and tell him if he could see his face reflected in it. The boy replied that he saw his face clearly. The magician, holding the boy's hand all the while, told him to continue looking intently into the ink and not to raise his head. He then took one of the little strips of paper inscribed with the forms of invocation and dropped it into the chafing dish upon the burning coals and perfumes which had already filled the room with their smoke. And as he did this, he commenced an MD1 STMCT muttering of words, which he continued during the whole process, excepting when he had to ask the boy a question or to tell him what he was to say. The piece of paper containing the words from the Quran he placed inside the forepart of the boy's takeya, or skullcap. He then asked him if he saw anything in the ink, and was answered no. But about a minute after, the boy, trembling and seeming much frightened, said, "I see a man sweeping the ground." When he has done sweeping, said the magician, "Tell me." Presently the boy said, "He has done." The magician then again interrupted his muttering to ask the boy if he knew what a bayrak, or flag, was, and being answered yes, desired him to say, "Bring a flag." The boy did so, and soon said, "He has brought a flag." "What color is it?" asked the magician. The boy replied, "Red." He was told to call for another flag, which he did, and soon after that he said he saw another brought, and that it was black. In like manner, he was told to call for a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh, which he described as being successively brought before him, specifying their colors as white, green, black, red, and blue. The magician then asked him, as he did also each time a new flag was described as being brought, "How many flags have you now before you?" "7," answered the boy. While this was going on, the magician put the second and third of the small strips of paper upon which the forms of invocation were written into the chafing dish and fresh frankincense and coriander seed having been repeatedly added, the fumes became painful to the eyes. When the boy had described the 7 flags as appearing to him, he was desired to say, "Bring the Sultan's tent and pitch it." This he did, and in about a minute after he said, "Some men have brought the tent, a large green tent. They are pitching it." And presently he added, "They have set it up." "Now," said the magician, "order the soldiers to come and pitch their camp around the tent of the Sultan." The boy did as he was desired, and immediately said, "I see a great many soldiers with their tents. They have pitched their tents." He was then told to order that the soldiers should be drawn up in ranks, and having done so, he presently said that he saw them thus arranged. The magician had put the 4th of the little slips of paper into the chafing dish, and soon after he did the same with the 5th. He now said, "Tell some of the people to bring a bull." The boy gave the order required and said, "I see a bull. It is red. 4 men are dragging it along, and 3 are beating it." He was told to desire them to kill it and cut it up and to put the meat into saucepans and cook it. He did as he was directed, and described these operations as apparently performed before his eyes. "Tell the soldiers," said the magician, "to eat it." The boy did so and said, "They are eating it. They have done and are washing their hands." The magician then told him to call for the Sultan, and the boy, having done this, said, "I see the Sultan riding to his tent on a bay horse, and he has on his head a high red cap. He has alighted to his tent and sat down within it." "Desire them to bring coffee to the Sultan," said the magician, "and to form the court." These orders were given by the boy, and he said that he saw them performed. The magician had put the last of the 6 little strips of paper into the chafing dish. In his mutterings, I distinguished nothing but the words of the written invocation, frequently repeated, excepting that on 2 or 3 occasions, when I heard him say, "If they demand information, inform them, and be ye veracious." But much that he repeated was inaudible, and as I did not ask him to teach me his art, I do not pretend to assert that I am fully acquainted with his invocations. He now addressed himself to me and asked me if I wished the boy to see any person who was absent or dead. I named Lord Nelson, of whom the boy had evidently never heard, for it was with much difficulty that he pronounced the name, after several trials. The magician desired the boy to say to the Sultan, "My master salutes thee, and desires thee to bring Lord Nelson. Bring him before my eyes, that I may see him speedily." The boy then said so, and almost immediately added, "A messenger has gone, and has returned, and brought a man, dressed in a black suit of European clothes. The man has lost his left arm. Dark blue is called by the modern Egyptians eswed, which properly signifies black, and is therefore so translated here." He then paused for a moment or two, and looking more closely and more intently into the ink, said, "No, he has not lost his left arm, but it is placed to his breast." This correction makes his description more striking than it had been without it, since Lord Nelson generally had his empty sleeve attached to the breast of his coat. But it was his right arm that he had lost. Without saying that I suspected that the boy had made a mistake, I asked the magician whether the objects appeared in the ink as if actually before the eyes, or as if in a glass, which makes the right appear left. He answered that they appeared as if in a mirror. This rendered the boy's description faultless. Whenever I desired the boy to call for any person to appear, I paid particular attention both to the magician and to Osman. The latter gave no direction either by word or sign, and indeed he was generally unacquainted with the personal appearance of the individual called for. I took care that he had no previous communication with the boys, and have seen the experiment fail when he could have given directions to them or to the magician. In short, it would be difficult to conceive any precaution which I did not take. It is important to add that the dialect of the magician was more intelligible to me than to the boy. When I understood him perfectly at once, he was sometimes obliged to vary his words to make the boy comprehend what he said. The next person I called for was a native of Egypt, who has been for many years resident in England, where he has adopted our dress, and who had been long confined to his bed by illness before I embarked for this country. I thought that his name, one not very uncommon in Egypt, might make the boy describe him incorrectly. though another boy on the former visit of the magician had described this same person as wearing a European dress like that in which I last saw him. In the present case, the boy said, "Here is a man brought on a kind of bier and wrapped up in a sheet." This description would suit, supposing the person in question to be still confined to his bed, or if he be dead. A few months after this was written, I have the pleasure of hearing that the person here alluded to was in better health. Whether he was confined to his bed at the time when this experiment was performed, I have not been able to ascertain. The boy described his face as covered and was told to order that it should be uncovered. This he did, and then said, "His face is pale, and he has moustaches, but no beard." Which is correct. Several other persons were successively called for, but the boy's description of them were imperfect, though not altogether incorrect. He represented each object as appearing less distinct than the preceding one, as if his sight were gradually becoming dim. He was a minute or more before he could give any account of the persons he professed to see towards the close of the performance, and the magician said that it was useless to proceed with him. Another boy was then brought in, and the magic square, etc., made in his hand, but he could see nothing. The magician said that he was too old. On another occasion, Shakespeare was described with the most minute correctness, both as to person and dress, and I might add several other cases in which the same magician has excited astonishment in the sober minds of Englishmen of my acquaintance. A short time since, after performing in the usual manner, by means of a boy, he prepared the magic mirror in the hand of a young English lady, who, on looking into it for a little while, said that she saw a broom sweeping the ground without anybody holding it, and was so much frightened that she would look no longer. An historical incident involving Cagliostro offers a second illustration. In the late 1770, Cagliostro visited Mitau in the Kurland province of Latvia and was entertained by a local master mason, Marshal van Meydem. Cagliostro demonstrated what is sometimes called colomb clairvoyance. The incident had many witnesses and was recorded in several contemporary reports. It is given in semi-fictional form by Frank King. Having anointed the head and left hand of the child with a special oil of wisdom, he inscribed some mystic letters on the anointed hand and commanded the pupil to look steadily at them. Hymns and prayers followed until the little fellow became strangely agitated and perspired profusely. "Now," he whispered, "the child commands the 7 pure spirits. What do you want him to see?" The marshal hesitated. He did not wish the little fellow to be frightened with something out of the ordinary. Any homely test would serve the purpose. "Can he tell us what his sister is doing?" The sorcerer muttered an incantation, then addressed the pupil in a low tone. "Can you see your sister?" he said. "Yes, I can see her." "What is she doing?" "She is seated by the window in her room. She places her hand to her breast." "Is she in love?" "No, she is in pain. I see the door open. My brother enters. She embraces him." "But that is impossible," cried the marshal. "My elder son is many leagues away." Joseph, Cagliostro, breathed upon the pupil's face and wakened him. "The vision can be verified," he said coldly. The marshal sent a messenger immediately to his house. The messenger returned soon and informed him that his son, whom he had thought so far away, had returned unexpectedly, and that shortly before her brother's arrival, the daughter had had an attack of heart palpitations. It is interesting that at the end of his life, he was imprisoned in a vertical tube cut into the solid rock at San Leo in Italy by the Inquisition. He wrote his own epitaph. "Much nonsense and many lies have been written about me, for no one knows the truth." E.J. Harrison relates a number of instances of verifiable clairvoyance performed by Zen initiates. The Sufis assert that Zen is a local development, to some extent deteriorated, of their own tradition, and was implanted in Japan by Sufis from Afghanistan. The following instances cover phenomena which the team witnessed in a Sufi circle in England. Harrison recounts the story of a Japanese sennin, yogi, called Tomokichi, who found himself in the company of a foreign missionary in Tokyo. Neither spoke the other's language nor pantomime. Having failed to convey much abstract conversation, the sennin closed his eyes for a moment, then proceeded to expound his viewpoint in fluent English. The missionary was dumbfounded, and, it appeared, so was the sennin, for he was totally ignorant of English, and, on coming out of his temporary trance, could not speak or understand a word. Nor had he any memory of the speech he had just made. The parallel between this account and the story of Tudor Pole in the presence of Abdu'l-Baha is remarkable. Harrison describes an educated modern Japanese called Kaneda, who earns his living as a schoolteacher and is in the habit of acting as interpreter at scientific conferences where papers have been submitted by foreign scientists in their own language. Though quite ignorant of the language involved, Kaneda gives an immediate translation of the content. He has also demonstrated that if a person writes an imaginary letter with an imaginary pen on a blank sheet of paper, he can call out the contents which have in fact never been committed to writing at all. A dervish teaching story relating to the Sufi master Bahauddin Naqshband tells how a would-be pupil approached Bahauddin. He had read the master's writings and wanted to enroll as a pupil. Bahauddin told the youngest member of his circle, a 16-year-old boy, to stand up. "How long have you been with us?" asked the sheikh. 3 weeks, O Murshid." "Have I taught you anything?" "I do not know." "Do you think so?" "I do not think so." The sheikh then said to him, "In this newcomer's satchel you will find a book of poems. Take it in your hand and recite the entire contents without mistake and without even opening it." The boy held the book unopened and then said, "I fear it is in Turkey." Bahauddin said, "Recite it." The boy proceeded to do as he was told, reading a closed book in a language he did not know. The stranger then fell on his knees and begged to be enrolled as a pupil. Bahauddin said, "It is this kind of phenomenon which attracts you. While it still does, you cannot really benefit from it. That is why, even if you have read my Risalat, you have not really read it. Come back when you have read it as this beardless boy has read it. It was only such study that gave him the power to recite from a book which he had not opened and at the same time prevented him from groveling in wonderment at the event." Power of will projection. In relation to powers under this category, the team encountered the most serious strictures on secrecy. Virtually no details of training or methods were freed for publication, and the team was obliged to offer the following illustrations only, without comment. An example of will projection is given in a Sufic treatise, Drops from the Fountain of Life, by Ali B. Hussein Kashifi, a Sufi in the Khwajagan master's tradition. It dates from about AD 1503. "In my youth I was ever with our Lord, our master Saiduddin of Kashgar at Herat. It happened that we one day walked out together and fell in with an assembly of the inhabitants of the place who were engaged in wrestling. To try our powers, we agreed to aid with our powers of the will one of the wrestlers, so that the other should be overcome by him, and after doing so, to change our design in favor of the discomforted individual. So we stopped, and turning towards the parties, gave the full influence of our united wills to one, and immediately he was able to subdue his opponent. As the person we chose, each in turn conquered the other, whichever we willed to prevail became the most powerful of the two, and the power of our wills was thus clearly manifested. On another occasion, 2 other persons, possessed of these same powers, fell in with an assembly of people, at a place occupied by prize-fighters. To prevent any of the crowd from passing between and separating us, we joined our hands together. 2 persons were engaged in fighting. One was a powerful man, whilst the other was a spare and weak person. The former readily overcame the latter, and seeing this I proposed to my companion to aid the weak one by the power of our wills. So he bade me aid him in the project, whilst he concentrated his powers upon the weaker person. Immediately a wonderful occurrence took place. The thin, spare man seized upon his giant-like opponent and threw him upon the ground with surprising force. The crowd cried out with astonishment as he turned him over on his back and held him down with apparent ease. No one present, except ourselves, knew the cause. Seeing that my companion's eyes were much affected by the effort which he had made, I bade him remark how perfectly successful we had been, and adding that there was no longer any necessity for our remaining there, we walked away. Harrison, in his Fighting Spirit of Japan, already quoted, gives examples of an oral tradition about the powers of the Zen masters. Some of these were related to him by present-day Japanese. A real master of fence in feudal days could exercise a species of mesmeric force at will to such good purpose that he himself would instantly become invisible to his antagonist, whose gaze would be helplessly fascinated by the point of the expert's sword, which in turn might be multiplied to seem like half a dozen points, all equally real. In the second place, the expert could arrest the movement of his adversary's weapon in the very act of striking. Paralyzed into immobility at such a juncture, the victim would be left with his entire body exposed to the expert's attack. In the third place, if the expert wished to avoid unnecessary exertion or to spare the life of his foe, he could, in a few minutes, convert the latter's bloodthirsty rage into fatuous good humor. I have been assured that the conversion of an enemy's anger into laughter is by far the most difficult. On a par with these astonishing performances is a manifestation of magnetic influence by experts, whereby birds can be made to fall to the ground from a tree, apparently lifeless, and again instantaneously revived and put to flight. All this belongs to an oral tradition recounted to Harrison by present-day judo students and experts, but he was able to find some examples of similar powers still exercised in modern Japan. He became friendly with an elderly Japanese Nobuyuki Kunishiga, who told him, "A man who has thoroughly acquired the art of Aiki no Jutsu verges on the divine. The clairvoyance so much talked about nowadays is nothing but a part of Aiki. The old masters of my school have sayings to the effect that with full knowledge of Aiki, one can see in the dark, bring walking men to a stop, or break a sword brandished to slay. These words can be accepted as true. I draw this conclusion from my own experience in stopping bleeding. I believe men can enter the divine realm through constant culture of their mental and physical faculties." Kunishiga, then a man of over 60, gave Harrison a display of an extraordinary power. He squatted down in approved Japanese fashion and invited Harrison to squat opposite him. Harrison, a 6-footer and very much more powerful than the elderly Japanese, was told to put both hands on Kunishiga's chest and push him over. No judo holds or twists were employed. It was simply a question of a 6-foot man trying to push over an old man squatting opposite him. Harrison almost had a seizure trying to do it and failed completely. Kunishiga then took his little finger, placed it lightly on Harrison's chest, and sent him flying. Kunishiga then tied the ends of a kimono sash together and put the loop around his neck. He then invited 2 of his students to pull him over. The utmost efforts failed to move him by as much as an inch. Kunishiga then calmly went for a stroll round the gymnasium, taking the 2 men with him in spite of their combined efforts to hold their ground. An interesting reference to the state, how in which powers of the will may be exercised, is given in Magic and Mysticism in Turkey by Lucy Garnett, who collected first-hand information about various Sufi groups in Turkey. There appear to be 2 different kinds of hal induced by methods of a totally different character. 1. An abnormal state of agitation by contagious emulation. It is possible in this state to endure physical injury without loss of blood, mysteriously and speedily healed. 2. Appears to be permanent or assumable at will, due to the 4th or highest degree. Sheikhs and dervishes of superior grade are equally credited with ability to acquire this degree of sanctity, and on attaining it, they become endowed with various spiritual and superhuman powers. Among these may be named what is termed the power of the will. Also relevant to the earlier passages quoted is another remark by Lucy Garnett. Not individuals only, however, but crowds have been known to be affected in this way by eminent dervishes. And according to Muslim legend, even opposing armies have been caused to desist from hostilities, completely subdued by the pacificatory spell thrown over them by some man of peace who has compelled their leaders to sign treaties drawn up by himself. Direct perception. What is called direct perception is one of the possible powers of developed man, but unlike, for example, clairvoyance and telepathy, it is not known in the West in the form practiced by Sufis, and the literature of Western occultism does not offer a convenient label. It involves making mental contact with another whole, material or otherwise, and reading it so as to obtain knowledge its nature, past, present or future. This knowledge is called direction by the Sufis, and is read in a form that accords with the cultural images and idiom of the percipient, not the subject. The team saw several impressive examples. They also saw exercises by which the faculty was developed. This involves a technique known as imprisoning the gaze. The pupil is taught directly by the sheikh and is shown how to concentrate his mental force on one object before deflecting it upon another from which he is to lift information. The technique cannot be learned without a teacher, though a false form of it can be otherwise acquired. The teacher not only contributes knowledge, but also a specific energy without which the process cannot be powered. One major use of the procedure is to verify the truth and relevance of traditional Sufic teaching material so that the process of Sufic influence on man is kept continuously renewed, active and effective. Direct perception, it is claimed, cannot be significantly developed in a pupil below a certain level of capacity and cannot be developed in an individual who has aspects of his nature which make him unworthy to serve humanity. A false form of direct perception may be acquired outside the conditions mentioned, but the result is distorted and the action becomes destructive of the operator. An example of direct perception exercised in a non-material field is given in an account by Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, the teacher of Andalusia. It is quoted in the Dervishes by J.P. Brown. Once when I was in the vicinity of the holy and reverend Kaaba in Mecca, it happened that, absorbed in mental reflections on the four great jurisconsults of Islamism, I beheld a person who continuously made the tawaf or circuit of that holy building. His height was quite as elevated as the Kaaba itself. Two other individuals were engaged in the same occupation, and whenever these were near to each other, the power would pass between them without, however, separating them. From this, I concluded that the individuals must belong to spiritual bodies only. As he continued his circuits, he recited the following: "Truly, we have been for many long years engaged in walking round this holy house, but you are doing it only now." On hearing these words, I formed a desire to know who he was and to what tribe he belonged. So I fixed him with my eyes, after the manner called Habzi Nazar, imprisoning the gaze, and when he had ended his circuit and desired to depart, he was unable to do so. Finally, he came to my side, and feeling that I was the cause of his detention, begged me to allow him to depart. I answered him with the words, "Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim," in the name of God, the Merciful and the Clement, and added, "I will allow you to go only after you have let me know what kind of a being you are, and to what tribe or people you belong." He replied, "I am of mankind." I next asked him how long it was since he left this world. He replied, "It is now more than 40,000 years. Surprised, I added, "You say it is so long, whilst it is only 6,000 years since Adam's time, and yet you state that you are of mankind." He answered, "The Adam you speak of was the father of the human race, though since his time only 6,000 years have elapsed, 30 other worlds preceded him." Theory of attraction. Subtending the various parapsychological energies which the Sufis employ, the team thought it could catch a glimpse of a unifying principle. The form in which this principle is enunciated at the present time is not available for publication, and is in any case of such a subtle and elusive nature as would make it very difficult for the team to summarize. The idea is, however, contained in a classical passage of Sufi poetry, which one S quoted by Sir William Jones. The most wonderful passage on the theory of attraction occurs in the charming allegorical poem Shirin and Farhad, or The Divine Spirit and a Human Soul Disinterestedly Pious, a work which from the first verse to the last is a blaze of religious and poetical fire. The whole passage appears to me so curious that I make no apology for giving you a faithful translation of it. There is a strong propensity which dances through every atom and attracts the minutest particle to some peculiar object. Search this universe from its base to its summit, from fire to air, from water to earth, from all below the moon to all above the celestial spheres, and thou wilt not find a corpuscle destitute of that natural attractability. The very point of the first thread in this apparently tangled skein is no other than such a principle of attraction, and all principles beside are void of a real basis. From such a propensity arises every motion perceived in heavenly or in terrestrial bodies. It is a disposition to be attracted which taught hard steel to rush from its place and rivet itself on the magnet. It is the same disposition which impels the light straw ore to attach itself firmly to amber. It is this quality which gives every substance in nature a tendency toward another, and an inclination forcibly directed to a determinate point.